Everyone was in debt, but no one asked who they owed. The hum of printing presses echoes through the night, a sound like insects swarming over a still warm body. It is the sound of promises made of paper, of futures borrowed against a past that never was. This is not the story of a market crash. It is not the tale of a single failed empire. This is the autopsy of a cage built not of iron but of idea, a system designed brick by brick across 3 centuries to be inescapable. You were born inside its walls. You were taught its rules were natural law. This is the story of the architects and the story of the ghost that wanders its hollow corridors, tracing the 7 stages of its silent, patient ascent. The first stage is the spark of ambition. It begins not with a roar, but with a whisper, a quiet proposition in a smoke-filled room. The year is 1694. A man, William Paterson, and his associates present a solution to a king. The king is broke, his wars are expensive, his treasury is bare. Paterson offers £1 million, a staggering sum, a lifeline. But it is not a gift. It is a trade. In return, the king grants them a charter, the Bank of England. The ambition was not merely to lend. It was to change the nature of reality itself. For the first time in history, a government's debt was made permanent. It would never be paid off. It would be managed, serviced. The state would now pay interest forever to a private corporation for the privilege of existing. This was the first brick, the initial spark of an idea that would consume the world, that a nation could be made a tenant on its own land, that sovereignty could be mortgaged. The ambition was to bind the future to the past with a chain of endless obligation. The document was signed, the ink was dry. A new kind of power was born, one that did not need crowns or armies to enforce its will. It would use something far more potent, the relentless, compounding logic of mathematics, the quiet ticking of the interest clock, a sound that would only grow louder with each passing year, each new generation born into its rhythm. This was the genesis, the moment the seed was planted in the fertile soil of a kingdom's desperation, a seed that would grow into a vine that strangled empires. The architects understood something fundamental that kings and queens did not. Political power was temporary, but financial power, embedded in the very structure of the state, could be eternal. It could outlive dynasties. It could survive revolutions. It was a parasite that learned to keep its host alive, but forever weakened, forever servicing the infection. The spark of ambition was not for riches alone. It was for a legacy woven into the fabric of time itself, a system that would dictate the choices of presidents and parliaments for centuries to come, all while remaining invisible to the people whose lives it shaped. The debt was the instrument. Control was the symphony. This spark ignited the forge of expansion. The system needed fuel. It needed scale. A century passes. The forge is stoked by a new kind of alchemist, Nathan Rothschild. He saw the bonds, the government's promises to pay, not as debts, but as a new kind of currency, a currency of trust, or the lack of it. He mastered the flow of information, a pigeon, a fast ship, a whispered rumor on the London Exchange. He knew the outcome of Waterloo before the government itself. And he bought. He bought when everyone else was selling in a panic. He bought the entire British government bond market for pennies. And when the news of victory was confirmed, he was not just rich. He was the market. He had forged a new truth. A nation's survival now depended on the confidence of men who traded its promises. The bond market was no longer a tool. It was a governor on the engine of the state. It made sovereign default mathematically impossible, not because the money was there, but because the collapse would be unthinkable. The system expanded, its roots digging deep into the bedrock of nations, feeding on their wars, their growth, their very breath. The forge of expansion required the heat of continual conflict and the hammer of speculation. Every war loan, every infrastructure project, every colonial venture was another link in the chain. The architects of this stage were not just financiers, they were cartographers of a new world order. They drew lines of credit across maps, connecting capitals in a web of mutual obligation. A default in one nation could now trigger panic in another. The system became global, interdependent, a financial ecosystem where every player was both predator and prey. The bondholder sat in a position of unassailable power. He held no office. He commanded no troops. Yet he could dictate terms to emperors. He could demand austerity from parliaments. His weapon was the threat of withholding credit, of calling in the promises, of revealing the entire edifice to be as fragile as it truly was. The expansion was not merely geographical, it was psychological. It embedded the necessity of debt deep within the culture of progress. To build a railway, a nation went into debt. To win a war, a nation went deeper into debt. To recover from a war, a nation went deeper still. There was no exit, only a perpetual forward motion, a continuous expansion into new debt to service the old. The forge glowed white-hot, melting down national sovereignty and pouring it into the molds of bond certificates. Each certificate was a tiny silent claim on the future labor of a nation's people, a claim they never agreed to but would be forced to honor. The system was learning, adapting, growing more sophisticated. It was creating a language that only a few could truly speak, a language of yields and coupons and maturity dates that obscured the simple, brutal reality. A portion of every tax paid, every good produced, every hour worked was now destined to flow upwards to the holders of the paper. The expansion seemed like prosperity. It felt like growth, but it was the growth of a vine, not a tree. It was spreading, covering everything, while slowly draining the life from the host. Then came the veil of debasement. The substance of money itself had to be altered. The gold coin, the silver standard, these were anchors. They were limits. The architects needed to remove the limits. In the quiet of a private club on Jekyll Island in 1910, a secret meeting took place. Bankers, senators, a handful of men. They arrived in the dead of night under false names. Their purpose was to design a new central bank for America, the Federal Reserve. It was presented as a stabilizer, a protector against panics. But its true design was something else. It was a machine for perpetual debt. The Fed would create money, not by mining gold, but by buying government bonds. The government would issue debt. The Fed would create currency to buy it. The circle was now complete. Money was debt. Debt was money. The veil was drawn. The tangible was replaced by the abstract. A dollar was no longer a claim on a metal. It was a claim on a promise to pay a debt that could never be repaid. The system had debased the very concept of value, replacing it with a beautiful self-referential illusion. The veil of debasement was the most profound magic trick ever performed. It made the chain look like a ribbon. It made the prison walls look like the horizon. By severing the link between money and a physical commodity, the architects unleashed the system from its final constraint. There was no longer a limited amount of gold in a vault. Now the only limit was confidence itself. The Fed could create dollars out of nothing with a keystroke to purchase the government's debt. This was the ultimate alchemy. It transformed the nation's IOU into the nation's currency. Every dollar in your pocket, every digital number in your bank account is literally a piece of the national debt. It is a testament to a promise. This was the final masterful stroke of design. It made the entire population unwitting stakeholders in the perpetuation of the debt. If the debt were ever paid off, the money would cease to exist. The system had engineered a perfect trap. To question the debt was to question the very existence of the money used to denominate it. The veil was so effective that most never even noticed the transition. They went from carrying gold and silver coins to carrying green pieces of paper, and then to flashing plastic cards, and then to tapping phones. The abstraction deepened with each generation. The substance faded into memory. The system now operated in the realm of pure information, a ghost in the machine, its workings opaque, its language impenetrable. It was managed by technocrats who spoke of monetary policy and quantitative easing, terms that masked the simple, brutal reality, the continuous creation of new currency to feed the endless hunger of the debt. The debasement was not of the coin's metallic content, but of the human understanding of value itself. Value became a fluctuating consensus, a collective hallucination managed by a central authority, and that authority's primary purpose was to ensure the hallucination never ended, that the music never stopped, that the debt could always be rolled over, renewed, and expanded. The cage now had no visible bars. It was made of air and numbers. The illusion grew into a fever, a global delirium. After the fires of world wars, the system was exported. It was the new gospel, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. They came bearing loans for developing nations, loans for roads, for dams, for progress. But the terms were a trap. The money was often spent on projects that benefited foreign corporations. The debt remained. In 1982, the trap was sprung. Paul Volcker at the Fed raised interest rates to kill inflation at home. For the developing world, it was a death sentence. Their dollar-denominated debt suddenly became impossible to service. They faced default. And then the architects returned. The IMF offered restructuring. More loans to pay the old loans, but with conditions. Structural adjustment. Sell your national assets. Cut your social spending. Open your markets. The nations were bled dry. $1 trillion a year began its silent migration from the public treasuries of the world to the private bondholders of the world. The fever was the belief that this was economics. It was not. It was a machinery of extraction. The nations were not failing. They were being farmed. The fever of illusion was a sickness that presented itself as health. It was the belief that more debt was the cure for too much debt. It was the spectacle of governments celebrating growth that was nothing more than an increase in borrowing. The fever dreams were vivid. Skyscrapers built on credit. Consumer societies fueled by mortgages and credit cards. The illusion of wealth was everywhere, a glittering surface on an ocean of red ink. The system had perfected the art of using the future to pay for the present. It created a world where everyone could feel rich as long as they didn't look at the balance sheet. The fever infected the collective psyche. It made prudence seem old-fashioned. It made saving seem foolish. The smart money was in leveraging, in betting on the perpetual expansion of the debt bubble. The architecture of the system ensured that this fever was the default state. Low interest rates, easy credit, these were the symptoms. They encouraged speculation over production, financial engineering over actual engineering. The economy slowly transformed from a system that made things into a system that made bets. The real economy of goods and services became a subsidiary to the financial economy of derivatives and debt instruments. The fever created a new aristocracy, not of land or title, but of fixed income assets. They were the rentiers of the new age, collecting their tribute not from peasants, but from entire nations through the mechanism of interest. The illusion was so complete that to point it out was to be labeled a heretic. The high priests of finance in their central banks and treasury departments spoke in reverent tones about managing the expectations of the market. The market was the new god, an omniscient, omnipotent force that demanded sacrifice. And the sacrifice was always the same. More debt, more structural adjustment, more austerity for the many to protect the capital of the few. The fever raged, burning through the substance of nations, leaving behind the hollowed-out shell of sovereignty. Inevitably comes the fracture of faith. A system built on promises cannot survive the death of belief. The citizen feels it first, a quiet unease. The work of a lifetime buys less. The safety nets fray. The politicians speak of difficult choices, of austerity. The money is always there for the interest payments, never there for the schools, the hospitals, the roads. The people look at the numbers. 38 trillion, 315 trillion. They are abstract, meaningless, but the feeling is concrete. The feeling of a future being hollowed out. The faith in the institution, in the currency, in the very social contract begins to crack. The fracture is not loud. It is the sound of a door closing softly on a room where hope once lived. It is the moment a young couple gives up on buying a home. It is the moment a retiree realizes the number in their bank account is a phantom. The system demands faith to function, and it systematically destroys the very thing it needs to survive. The fracture of faith is a slow, silent earthquake. It does not topple buildings in a single dramatic crash. It creates countless tiny fissures that spread through the foundation of society. It is the teacher who can no longer afford to live in the city she teaches in. It is the engineer who sees his profession outsourced while financiers are celebrated. It is the growing realization that the rules are rigged, that the game is fixed. The language of the system becomes a source of suspicion. Stimulus, quantitative easing, bail-in. These are not technical terms to the public anymore. They are incantations used by a priesthood to justify the transfer of wealth. The fracture is the loss of a shared story. The story was that hard work leads to prosperity, that saving is virtuous, that the currency is a stable store of value. That story is now in tatters. It is replaced by a darker, more cynical narrative that connections matter more than character, that debt is a tool for control, that the future is something to be feared, not built. This fracture manifests politically as polarization. When people lose faith in the central economic story, they turn on each other. They look for scapegoats. They retreat into tribalism. The center cannot hold because the center was built on an economic promise that has been broken. The architects in their isolated towers may not hear the cracking at first. They see only the data. A dip in consumer confidence, a rise in political extremism. They are mystified. They have provided liquidity. They have stabilized the markets. They do not understand that they are trying to fix a broken engine with more fuel, while the driver has lost all faith in the road. The fracture of faith is the most dangerous stage for the system. It can survive a banking crisis. It can survive a market crash, but it cannot survive the widespread, silent conviction that it is fundamentally illegitimate. This is the point where the music is about to stop, where everyone is still dancing, but each dancer is secretly looking for the exit. This fracture widens into the flood of folly. The response to a crisis of faith is not to restore trust, but to double down on the illusion. When the debt becomes too large, the solution is more debt. When the currency weakens, the solution is to print more of it. The printing presses hum louder. The digital ledgers flash with ever-increasing zeros. The system, in its final stages, begins to consume its own logic. It lends money at 0% interest to keep the debtors from collapsing. It buys its own debt to prop up the market. It becomes a Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. The flood is not of water, but of paper and light. It drowns all signal in noise. It makes rational calculation impossible. The folly is the belief that the problem is a lack of liquidity. The problem is the design of the cage itself. The flood does not cleanse. It merely obscures the ruins beneath the surface. The flood of folly is the spectacle of a system at war with reality. It is the central bank purchasing assets from itself. It is the government issuing debt to pay the interest on its existing debt. It is the creation of trillions of units of currency to prevent the deflation of a bubble that was created by the previous trillions. The folly is the desperate final attempt to maintain the illusion of solvency. It is the financial equivalent of trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The flood creates bizarre inversions of value. It makes risk-free assets yield nothing. It punishes savers and rewards speculators. It forces pension funds and insurance companies to make ever riskier bets simply to meet their obligations, weaving the entire financial ecosystem into a tightly coupled, fragile network where a failure in one corner can trigger a cascade. The architects of the flood are no longer masters of the system. They are its hostages. They are trapped by the monster they created. They know that stopping the flood, turning off the presses, would cause an immediate and catastrophic collapse. So they must keep going. They must create more money, more debt, more complexity. The floodwaters rise, lifting the prices of financial assets to dizzying, disconnected heights. While the real economy of Main Street stagnates, the inequality becomes a chasm. Those who own assets see their paper wealth soar. Those who live on wages see their purchasing power erode. The social contract, already fractured, is now washed away entirely. The flood of folly is a frantic, last-ditch effort to preserve the system by destroying its meaning. It is the point where the numbers on the screen become completely unmoored from any tangible representation of human labor or natural resources. It is the triumph of the abstract over the actual. And in this flood, the original purpose of finance, to facilitate the efficient allocation of capital for productive enterprise, is utterly lost. Finance becomes an end in itself, a self-licking ice cream cone, a closed loop of speculation and debt creation that serves no one but the system's own perpetuation, and finally, the final hush of oblivion. This is not an explosion. It is a slow settling of dust. It is the quiet acknowledgement that the game is over. The $38 trillion U.S. debt cannot be paid off. To pay it off would require extracting every dollar from the economy. It would collapse the money supply itself. The debt is permanent. It is the new landscape. The silence is the understanding. The bondholders are not a cabal of evil men. They are pension funds. They are insurance companies. They are anyone who owns a piece of the promise. The system was engineered so that everyone in the end has a vested interest in the perpetuation of the cage. The profit is not in the repayment. The profit is in the eternal service of the debt, the endless transfer of wealth from the labor of the many to the capital of the few. The hush is the sound of acceptance. The system was never meant to be escaped. It was meant to be endured. It is the tombstone of an empire that mortgaged its soul, and the quiet, windless peace of the cemetery that remains. The final hush is the end of history, not with a bang, but with a spreadsheet. It is the realization that there will be no dramatic collapse, no great awakening, no moment of reckoning. There will only be the slow, grinding, managed decline, the perpetual austerity, the forever trade-off between servicing the debt and funding the society. The hush is the sound of a population that has run out of alternatives, that has internalized its own powerlessness. It is the resignation of the doctor who knows the patient is terminal but continues to administer treatments for the sake of protocol. The architects are gone now. Their names are in history books, celebrated as visionaries. The system they built operates on autopilot, guided by algorithms and the cold logic of compound interest. It is no longer controlled by anyone. It simply is. It is the environment. It is the weather. The hush of oblivion is the point where the struggle ceases, where the question of escape becomes irrelevant because the concept of outside has been lost. The cage has become the world. And in this world, the only truth that remains is the quiet, inexorable flow of wealth from the bottom to the top, a river flowing through a silent, conquered land. The ruins are not of stone and mortar. They are of promise and potential. They are the dreams that were never dreamed, the inventions that were never invented, the lives that were lived in service to a number that could only grow. This is the masterpiece of the architects. A prison so perfect its inmates defend its walls. Every empire thinks it's different, until the smoke smells the same. If this story stirred something in you, subscribe to Wealth Rex, where the ruins of money still whisper their truths.